Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our fourth webinar on deaf employment. Before we dive in, I'd like to give you some technical tips, if you will, for today's webinar. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, please use the Q&A feature to pose questions. That's where we'll be selecting and answering your questions, either live or via chat. The microphone is on the lower left. You can use that for sound. Live captioning is available. And please do again use the Q&A feature to ask a question. My name is Tommy Horges, and I am Gallaudet University's Associate Provost for Student Success and Academic Quality. I am very honored to be part of the group that is here today, providing this webinar, this very exciting webinar. And it would not be possible without the support of four entities: Gallaudet University, NAD, who is represented today by Howard Rosenblum, and Zainab, Communication Services for the Deaf, CSD, Christy Ramos, and then finally RIT, NTID, John Macco. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide tips, do's and don'ts on providing access services. All of the employers, all of the audience members are here to understand how to strengthen communication access services for deaf and hard of hearing employees, how to improve them. We often don't have the opportunity to talk with access providers themselves and hear from their perspective, because whether it's an interpreter, an interpreting agency owner, or a CART provider, often they don't have the opportunity, they're not given the opportunity to provide their perspective and some tips that they feel could help strengthen these services. So with that, we are excited to bring you four outstanding panelists that represent the accessibility provider's point of view. This was a demand actually from 3 webinars ago. What we've learned in the series is that many of you are very knowledgeable about how important communication access is and very much understand the need to provide a minimum, at least legally required accommodations. What we're here to do is to talk about what you can do to go above and beyond. And that seems to be what the request is from the audience, that you as employers are ready to provide communication access and then work that relationship with those access providers, specifically who you're here from today, to improve those services. The webinar will be 60 minutes, 40 minutes will be panel discussion, and we will have 4 quick polls. We hope to reserve 15 or so minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience. I am now honored to introduce our 4 panelists, starting with Pat Graves. Please turn on your camera, Pat.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. It is really an honor. My name is Pat Graves, and I am president of Caption First. And we're a real-time captioning company, and we also provide post-production captions as well. We serve people here in the United States, whether it's in the community or the workplace, and we also serve a lot of United Nations clients and companies all over the world. We have been in business for 31 years. And again, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Pat, it's an honor to have you here. The next esteemed panelist is Delisa Robinson. Could you turn on your camera, please?
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this today. My name is Delisa Robinson. I have been an interpreter for nearly 20 years. I'm also the co-owner of a company that is called Accessibility Integrated Media, AIM. Now, we provide interpreting services for both live and pre-recorded content. What is unique about my company is that we work with certified deaf interpreters, or CDIs, so interpreters who are deaf themselves, to work with pre-recorded content. And that is unique because a variety of companies don't actually provide that service. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Delisa. It's an honor to have you here with us today. The next panelist I'd like to invite is Brianne Berger. Please do appear. It's an honor to be here on the panel. I am here to bring a perspective as a consumer. I work for the federal government as part of Deaf in Government organization, and I socialize with many deaf and hard of hearing people, and I feel like I have a lot to offer, and I'm looking forward to contributing to the conversation. You used to also provide accommodations, right? So you have the perspective of a consumer as a deaf person, and then also as an accessibility service provider. Great. Last but not least, Mark Allen Morrison.
Hello. I am truly inspired to be here with all of you today. I work as an interpreter, and I also own an agency. And my agency is Diversified Sign Language Services, DSLS, and we provide community interpreting as well as interpreting of pre-recorded content. And I'm so happy to be a part of this panel with everyone today. We do legal and technical interpreting.
I'm going to ask you to come back on in just a moment, so please turn your videos off now for a moment. Like some other folks who have an important legal perspective about what communication access means. Howard Rosenblum, I'd like to ask you to turn your camera on. He's the Executive Director of the National Association of the Deaf. Howard.
Hello, and thank you for the introduction, Tommy. I am so honored to be here. And, you know, deaf and hard of hearing people, it is so important for them to have access for their success in the workplace. But I really want to look forward to listening to our 4 wonderful panelists rather than hearing so much from me today. But I'm here just to talk about what effective communication means in the context of employment. Title I of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, covers employment And there are a number of other laws, including the Rehab Act of 1973, which covers any federal employment as well as federal contractors. Any location that receives federal funds is also under that act. Both of these acts demand equal access for employees, which includes deaf and hard of hearing employees. Now, that can mean a variety of things depending on the type of work, depending on the skills required, depending on the individual deaf or hard of hearing person. So all of those variables must be considered to determine what, in fact, effective communication looks like for that person. Now, the goal is not to figure out per se what the employer's burden should be. What is most important is to figure out how that deaf and hard of hearing employee can contribute in the best way to that employment and be successful in their work. So the employee is not, it's not about obligation or what one has to do. It's about inviting these diverse perspectives in the workforce. And it's also about making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate, to discuss, to contribute, to bring their ideas to their work. And again, effective communication under the law, as most people know, as most employers know, better than everyone else, the law is just not that specific. There's no list of what exactly the expectations are. It's very general. But the general expectation is that when you hire someone with a disability, you can't discriminate against them and they must be accommodated. They must have reasonable accommodations provided so that they're able to do their jobs. So there's not a requirement to provide the maximum accommodation, the most expensive accommodation, but you do need to make sure that whatever you provide is providing effective communication. And again, what that is can vary depending on the type of the work, the skills involved, and the individual, as well as what the company needs. So the best solution is almost always to ask that deaf or hard of hearing person so that they can help inform what effective communication needs for them. And today we'll be talking about the resources where you can get information about who can help you to fulfill those needs. And so that's what we're going to get into in today's panel. And I just want to end with, a lot of people know who I am and that I'm a person who loves to sue, but I am happy to say that those of you who are here on today's call, I'm not going to have to worry about suing you because you are already taking that first step. You already know the right thing to do. You've already hired deaf and hard of hearing people, but we just want to take it further by figuring out, what else should I be doing? And that's amazing that you're here trying to get those answers. So thank you for joining today's panel. And I look forward to you watching the 4 panelists today. I'm going to turn it back over to Tommy now.
Thank you, Howard. I really appreciate that introduction to communication access because there's not a one size fits all solution. And that's why the panelist is going to provide a real 360 type of point of view from an accessibility providers so that you can strengthen your ability to support deaf and hard of hearing employees and build your relationship with them. So with that, I'd like first to find out who's with us today. We have over 500 of you. So we'd like to know who you are. I have a quick poll. I will allow you to answer. First, if you and your company use accessibility services for work, which of the following do you use? Freelance interpreters, in-house staff interpreters, real-time captioning, auto captions. You haven't used any of those. You're learning the options or other. So please do answer. And I'll give everyone a minute and then close the poll and share the results with the audience. All right, 10 seconds left. Seems we're still getting more answers. I'll give everyone another 10, 15 seconds. All right, here are our results. Seems 60% are using freelance interpreters. Next, 39% in-house staff interpreters. 38% are using real-time captioning, 33% using auto captions. And then 15% of you are not yet using, but learning options. That's great. For those of you who are, it's important to know who's using freelance interpreters, because during the webinar, we can talk about what the difference is between using a freelance versus in-house staff interpreters. There might be some pros and cons, impacts in communication, and it might impact quality. Let's do one more poll of the audience, and then we'll begin with our panelists. The second poll says, as a hearing employer, do you feel equipped and or confident with the knowledge of accommodations being provided? These are all confidential, of course. Really, this is an opportunity to show a bit of vulnerability in the spirit of reflecting and thinking, you know, listen, if I'm a person, I'm hearing and I'm an employer, what kind of knowledge do I have with providing accommodations? Are you very confident in that? Confident, not confident, or not applicable? Here's the poll. Answers are still coming in, and I'll give everyone about another 30 seconds. It's exciting. All right, here are our results. 16% are very confident. 37% say they're confident. 27% not confident, and it's not applicable to 21%. So perhaps you're not hearing, or maybe you're just more curious and you've come to this webinar for learning. For those of you who have said you're not confident, I mean, that shows a recognition on your part and a need to improve services. And that's what we're all here for. We're all here to support one another. So with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to come on. And let's begin our webinar. All right, the first question would be, as an accessibility provider, often, you know, you're not really given the opportunity to engage and ask questions to employers who are providing accommodations to their employees and requesting these services. What's something you wish these folks knew before sending in an accessibility request? Anyone like to answer first?
I can go ahead. So as a deaf individual, one of the things that I want employers to know before they make a request about my reasonable accommodation is that not every deaf person is the same. We are a diaspora of hearing levels. Some people prefer interpreting, others prefer captioning, others have preferences for different types of interpreting. Some use signed exact English, whereas others use American Sign Language. So it's really important for you to communicate with your deaf employee to know what exactly they need. And if you have more than one deaf employee, to talk with all of them, because what works for one may not work for all. Everyone has their own distinct needs. And so it's really important to do that first before reaching out to an access provider and telling them what you need, because they're going to want to know the context. Is this person using American Sign Language or some signed English system? Do they need captions? Also, all of the details about the event, all the W questions, the who, the what, the when, the where. Is it going to be a business attire event? Is it more informal? Really, all of those details are important to tell access providers, because whoever they send is going to be a reflection of the deaf consumer in that situation. So when I am doing my work, the interpreter who comes is going to be representing me, and I want it to be a true reflection to my employer so that my employer can see my work performance, and the interpreter is part of making that happen. The other thing that I want employers to understand is about the budget, and it's really important. Because when employers say things like, well, I'm really concerned about the cost of this service, I don't think I can provide interpreters for the meeting. What they're conveying to me is that I am not important, that my contributions are not valuable to the company, and that my work is not valued. And so they say basically that the cost of the interpreters is more important than me being there. And that can be a very stressful thing to encounter. So then I have to worry about convincing them to get interpreters. And I think if they do this the first time, will they do it again? And the other thing that I explain to employers when it comes to the cost of interpretation is that each interpreter is going to have different rates. And it's probably better to work with a contract to find a cost-effective way of doing that. So there is a way to negotiate for ongoing services. So again, the rate may vary if you're requesting interpreters 2 or 3 days out versus 2 weeks out. And so whoever you call, whatever access provider, if they say some dollar amount is higher than some other access provider, that's worth considering. Again, you can get a contract and you can get a standardized rate, and you might have to make a few phone calls to get there. But that is part of what it is when you're working with deaf and hard of hearing people.
That's really a lot of important information that employers should know. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, Mark, go ahead. Amen to what she just said. I really recommend you go back and read the transcript of what she just said, because all of those things are important to consider. What was mentioned about asking the deaf person and how important that is, what the deaf person wants, because often an employer will ask a company, I have a deaf person, what would they need? And as an access provider, I get some of those questions from an employer, and I always direct them to the deaf person because they're the most knowledgeable about their own needs. So it's very important to start there and ask them. The second part that I wanted to add is what you are already doing, learning about the different requirements and the different legal requirements. Some companies have no idea. And then they're asking questions to me like, who's responsible to pay? Legally, who's responsible to pay? Now, every provider is not always knowledgeable about the intricacies of these laws. So it's important for you to have a little base knowledge about the ADA, for example, who is responsible to provide these accommodations and pay for them. I would say the employers need to educate themselves about that process. And if you're already here, you're already in that, you're already motivated to do that, you're in the right place.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean, I think Brianne said it so well. I just want to echo that. At the same time, when there are requests for interpreters, there is important information to know, and maybe it's helpful for you to understand why we need that information. If I come up with a hypothetical where we're talking about a white interpreter at a Black Lives Matters protest, for example, the deaf person there is still having access to the event because there is an interpreter there, but it also impacts there. That interpreter is the wrong fit for that situation. So it's important to consider about why we're asking for these details. It's because we want to make sure that an interpreter is an appropriate fit for the situation and that there's not a disconnect or something missing from that message. And so that's really key. And that's what I wanted to add.
Pat.
Thank you. I will jump in from the captioning point of view. And one of my first questions to any companies that hire us for captioning is, what is your vision for the webinar? What is your vision for the conference? What's it going to look like? And what is the technology? Because it's fine to say, I want captioning, but it's more important to say, I want captioning that's integrated into the platform. How can we accomplish that? Not all platforms are created equal. And some platforms allow embedded captions, others don't. What happens when they're streaming? How do we go from one streaming company up to the cloud and then out to YouTube and Facebook and all of the other platforms? Do we go through Vimeo? Something like that. And so from my point of view, I have to really, really work with employers to understand what they want and then make sure that I can get the technology to work properly with them.
If I can add to that, it's also important after a request is made to understand that sometimes things aren't done in the moment. So if you have an ongoing event and an agency has given information to the interpreting team to know what to expect for a given event, that's great. But what if the job is canceled? Have I been told that so I can tell the interpreters that? As a freelance interpreter, I've had in situations where I've driven all the way in a snowstorm, gotten there, only to be told, oh, that was canceled a couple of weeks ago. So that communication is key to our processes and to make sure that when an event happens, it's going to affect an event, that the interpreting team is involved in that communication so that they are told as well.
Two other things I'd like to add, going back to the idea of cost. Some agencies, some freelance interpreters have a minimum time that they will work for, 2-hour minimum, for example. And so your meeting might be only 30 minutes and you're thinking, I have to pay for an interpreter for 2 hours. Well, use that time. Think of other things. Perhaps the employee might want to work and meet with other coworkers, their own supervisor. Think about creative ways to use that 2 hours worth of time. Don't think about, well, I only need them for this 30 minutes. I'm not going to hire them because I have to pay for them for 2 hours. Add work in those 2 hours to make it worthwhile. I think it's also really important, the federal government has some security measures. A lot of buildings, the courthouse, they have security that people must walk through. And so that information is really important in the request. Let the person know this interpreter is going to have to come early because they're going to have to go through several different security measures, and that will take time. I wanted to ask a follow-up question about the process of sending in a request. So if an employer has engaged with the deaf and hard of hearing employee and gotten a list of their needs and accommodations, and now I, as the employer, am going to contact agencies. And we all know agencies don't always have equal quality in terms of their services. So we're contacting an agency. What should an employer know to give to the agency? What kind of information? I just wanted to see if there's any other opportunities to add about the process itself in terms of connecting with that agency to provide communication access services.
I can go. I think it's okay to give the name and contact information of the deaf consumer so that if the interpreter is late or there's traffic or it's an online virtual platform and they need a link to get in, so to connect them in that way. And now working virtually, I see that there are a lot of video platforms that do not have great video quality. And so for me, for example, my agency uses Microsoft Teams. I don't want to call out that platform, but there are some that don't have great video quality. And so sometimes I can't see the interpreter and I'll have to ask the interpreter to call me directly and actually use FaceTime with me on a separate device so that I can make sure I see the interpreter and then they call into the meeting and then I'm able to access the meeting on Microsoft Teams. So sometimes it's important to have that direct connection with the interpreter. But I think it's also important to ask your deaf employees before sharing that information with the agency. I don't want you to just do that without looping them in that conversation.
I was thinking too, flexibility is important. I was thinking about a job interview, for example. Before that appointment of an interview, my agency beforehand. Yes, we have a 2-hour minimum, but we'll ask for a resume beforehand. I'm often asking for the interpreter to secure time to meet with the deaf person to make sure they have met one another and that communication is flowing well between the two of them. All of that can happen before this actual interview. So when you think about that 2-hour time frame, don't think about that 2 hours only covering what is actually needed during the interview, but there's a lot of pre-work going into that as well. Yeah, for very important meetings like interviews, job performance evaluation, you can't expect the interpreter to know all of that information. They need to be prepared. Could you elaborate? Someone mind elaborating on what that prep could look like? Delisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that by saying it's important for interpreters to have preparatory materials, and that's true for CART providers as well, which is something else that my agency provides. And so for interpreters, we need to be able to do a mind map to really understand the job so that we can figure out what we're walking into. So maybe it's a presentation, maybe it's a resume, it might be a meeting agenda, bios of panelists. All of those preparatory materials are really helpful for us. So for example, when we're interpreting, we're spelling the names of people, which means we need to know how those names are spelled. And that can be really important for us to know ahead of time so that we can do what we need to do to walk into that meeting ready to interpret accurately. Now, in virtual jobs, which is the world we're living in right now, it's important to communicate with employees about how they can set up the format, what that's going to look like. For this event that we're doing right now, we met ahead of time to work out our logistics with the interpreting services as well as with CART. So can the CART person connect to the meeting ahead of time to make sure that they are assigned? Will people be turning their videos on or off? Will people be using the Q&A feature or the chat feature? All of these things are important for interpreters and CART providers to know as they can work with the team to engage. And there will also be conversations about expectations for interpreters switching between throughout the job and thinking about the roles of the different speaker who will be working from American Sign Language to English and vice versa. And so all of those logistics are part of how we can assess the job. And so we can answer the questions of the interpreting team and they can walk in ready to make the event go smoothly.
I'll add for virtual meetings specifically. I think it's really important to communicate that whoever is hosting the meeting, pin the interpreter. I can't tell you how many times I have attended meetings, virtual meetings, the interpreter's there, but I can't find the interpreter. There are literally so many attendees. There's too many people. There are pages and pages of squares, and I'm scrolling through the pages trying to find. I use the chat sometimes, but then sometimes I've even gone to meetings where the chat has been turned off. And so the company who's hosting then, or could designate someone who's, going to be controlling technology and make sure that the interpreter is pinned and visible throughout the entirety of the meeting. And those are some details. That's why it's so important to work out ahead of time.
That's a really good point. And I think it's interesting for Pat as a CART provider, that's a really unique position to be in. Because interpreters are used to being in the room, but with CART, you may not be seeing it. And here we are with Captions, but the person is somewhere entirely different. They're not here on our screen. And so when you think about the names of the key people in the meeting and how important those are, the spelling of those names, I can only imagine. So Pat, I'm not sure if you want to add anything about what sort of preparatory materials are helpful for CART providers specifically.
And thank you for that. Everything has been said beautifully because the needs of the interpreters are so similar to the needs of the captioners ahead of time. And we have to not only learn how to spell names, but we have to program them in ahead of time. And I'll just take this one step further because everything that has been said is perfect for CART and for interpreting. But one thing I like to do is to chat with the company that hires me, and I'll kind of mention that it's really important that the moderator is actually very strong, because if we don't have a visual, which is often for CART, And we just are listening to people. When Thomas, he just threw the floor to me. He said, Pat, what do you think? And so as the CART provider, I know there's 4 speakers. One of them is named Pat. So by deduction, the next speaker is Pat Graves, and we're able to put the name up ahead of time. So also part of the prep with employers is to help them be strong in their moderation role. And I find that is also often very helpful. And again, in addition to everything that Mark and Delisa and Brianne said. So thank you for the floor.
I don't know if some of the people in the audience noticed earlier, but we have an interpreter on the screen right now, Amanda, and she looked away, probably typing to the other team interpreter certain terminology. So that's part of the way that they work together as a team. So there is this work happening behind the scenes that often might not be visible, and that can add to the stress. So any prep that is given to interpreters ahead of time can help them to be prepared to reduce that stress in the moment. Let's turn over to Mark now.
It's funny that you just pointed out the 2 interpreters. And we always call each other a team in the field, but it's a real challenge for people right now to understand, challenge for everyone to understand why you need 2 interpreters and not just 1. And it's been challenging to answer that question. I have been alone working for 3 hours in the past, but that was a one-on-one situation. Sometimes only an hour will require more than 1 interpreter. So it really is situational and dependent. Employers sometimes might not understand why an event needs 2 interpreters. And it's not just because an interpreter is tired, so to speak, or burnt out. Captioning has to be exact for legal reasons. It has to be accurate, interpreting as well. And so you have to talk with the communication provider when they're requesting 2, or when you're offering 2, and you feel like that's the best fit. That's a conversation to be had to understand why it would be needed to have a team of 2 or just 1.
Those are really good points. So now I want to turn to the don'ts. What should employers not be doing when they're making requests or trying to figure out communication access for their deaf employees? Delisa?
The first thing that comes to mind is something that Brianne already mentioned. Don't assume. Don't assume you already know that person's needs. Don't assume that all deaf people need the same thing and that they're all the same. Don't assume all interpreters are going to be the same. Not all agencies work the same. Don't assume you'll have a similar experience. Employers, companies that you might have already been working with, agencies or with specific interpreters, they're going to be used to doing something a certain way. And some people might be learning not great behavior, and then they contact my company and I'm saying, you have interpreters working for 4 hours alone? We would strongly recommend a team of 2 interpreters for that type of job. And then we get challenged. And then I find myself having to explain and re-educate people about what truly are best practices. And it's a challenge, because people have already been used to that thought process and those behaviors. And to explain to them why they're not acceptable can be challenging.
Okay, I see we just did an interpreter switch there. And I want to shift gears a bit to some of the questions from the audience that fit with some of the questions that I had with us. So often employers think, well, I got an interpreter. Why do I need this specific interpreter? Is it what I did good enough? So if we could talk to about what's the difference between getting any interpreter versus getting the right interpreter, and how certification plays a role in this. Who would like to weigh in on that question? I see some people smiling, chuckling even.
Where do we start? Sure, I can begin.
Okay, Mark.
Certification is important. Is it necessary? It's going to depend on the situation. being qualified is important. You know, it also depends on the deaf person's level of comfort and trust in that interpreter. You know, when we go back and say, what are our don'ts? Don't assume that interpreter is good. You might think that that interpreter is good, but you need to ask the deaf person how they're experiencing that interpreter. What's their feedback? Were they comfortable with that interpreter's skills? You also might want to hire an interpreter who's outside a neutral party to evaluate your services from time to time. That's a good idea.
This is Bree Ann. I can basically talk about two components here. So the first thing that I want to say about having a specific interpreter. So deaf people already have a lot of interactions with interpreters. I mean, we've been interacting with them essentially from birth. And so some of us have built relationships with certain interpreters and know that they will know my stuff. They will know my communication style. They'll have an understanding of my communication mode. They'll know my work terminology, my acronyms. And so that's why I want that person, because they are going to convey how good I am at my work. And I want an interpreter that's going to make me as good as I am. But we have to remember that interpreters are humans as well. And everyone is going to make mistakes sometimes, right? And so there are some interpreters who their interpreting quality is just not as great, and others are phenomenal. And we meet an interpreter and maybe we've never met each other before. And maybe the chemistry just isn't a good fit. Maybe it's not a good vibe, and that's going to actually cause some things to go awry in a certain situation. And maybe it's neither of their fault per se. It's just a matter of not knowing the context, not knowing what's going into it. And maybe it just isn't a good fit. You know, sometimes you meet someone on the street and the first time you met, you think you like them right away. Maybe you don't. The same thing is true with deaf people and interpreters. There's that just human connection part of it, that interaction piece that may or may not be vibing. So with that being said, I want to bring it to the topic of certification, which could be a really long debate. And I am in the camp of my personal perspective being that the Americans with Disabilities Act says effective communication. It does not say certified, it does say effective. And so to me personally, I don't honestly care if an interpreter is certified or not. Because to me, the certification says something about, okay, they went through an interpreting program, they took a certain test, they did these things to get to this point of being certified. But even with that certification, as a human, they can still come and mess up. And so a certified interpreter is not always better than someone who is not certified. What we have to remember is that there are hearing people who grew up in the deaf world, and we often use the term child of deaf adults, or maybe siblings of deaf adults. So people who have parents or siblings who are deaf, who have been users of the language for a long time, and maybe they never got certified, but they know what they're doing as interpreters. So sometimes I'd rather go with that person because they already have the fluency, the understanding of deaf culture, deaf mannerisms, and I might rather go with that person who grew up with deaf parents, who's already had experience in the deaf community, regardless of their certification or not. So it really varies, but you have to think about the human factor in things. Also, there's this topic of what we refer to as DNS, which stands for do not send. And I'm sure that many of you probably heard that term from your deaf employees, like, oh, I don't want you to send that person again, put them on my DNS list. And you might wonder where that comes from as the employer, that if you did something wrong, and it's not really about you doing something wrong. Again, it goes back to, did they get along? Was that interpreter skilled? Maybe that interpreter had a bad day. I mean, there can be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe that deaf person already knows something about that interpreter and just doesn't want to work for them again. And so again, you should just go ahead and document that information. The next time you call for interpreters, say, sorry, but we do not want these specific interpreters to come back. And it's totally fine to do that. The important thing is that you have effective communication in the workplace, and that's the goal on everyone's slate here.
And that really speaks to an earlier point about asking the deaf person what accommodations that they need, and that they could define what their preferred interpreter is. Pat. What's the difference between providing CART and auto captions? You can talk to us. I mean, we know that there is a difference. Do CART providers have their own certification process? What's that look like?
Sure. Thanks for letting me loop back onto the other question, and then I'll move forward, Thomas. So I am not reflecting exactly what Mark and what Brianne said, because I require certification in my company, period, in order to be on my team. And I know that there are CART providers who are not certified, who are wonderful CART providers. And I think that that's great. But in general, I don't use them. I don't invite them on my team. And the reason is because I have to, a lot of companies want me to prove that my team is qualified. And one way to prove that is through certification. The other way to prove quality is I don't allow anyone on the team unless they have been assessed and taught how we do things. And so I'm very hardcore about that. I think I stand alone in the industry as far as requiring the certification and then assessing everyone, even if they've been doing it for 20 years. So that is just something that I wanted to bring up, a little bit different from what Mark and Brianne said. Now, moving on to, why don't we just turn on the auto captions? And I was really struck by the percentages earlier. 38% have real-time captioners and 33% of the audience used the auto captions. And so what I'll acknowledge is auto captions are here and they absolutely serve a purpose. I do not think that they serve as well as real-time captioners do. And some of the differences is a real-time captioner, yes, we absolutely go for verbatim, but we also go for readability and we go for accessibility. And so only a human can judge the content, get the feel of it, understand the inflection of the voice of the speaker so that we know where to put the punctuation in. And one fun thing in court reporting, they always do this in court reporting school. I killed my wife with an upswing in the sound. So that's a question mark. Like you're accusing me of killing my wife, as opposed to I killed my wife, period. And so inflection really makes a huge difference. And that is only capable of being captured by a real-time captioner. So the answer is yes, auto captions are here. They serve a purpose. And yes, professional human captioners are the better, higher quality choice.
Yeah, accuracy too. It has to be accurate. I want to move to quick poll number 3, and this is for deaf employees out there in the audience. If you are a deaf employee, how satisfied are you with the access services that you're receiving? Very satisfied, satisfied, not satisfied, I don't receive access services, or not applicable. All right, 15 seconds left. Okay. There's 10% are very satisfied, 14% say satisfied, 5% are not satisfied, and the rest seems didn't apply. Interesting data. I'd like to ask Brianne to elaborate a little bit just about your preferred access services. What do you use? What kind of services do you request? And What are some of the situations where you'll request perhaps a specific accommodations, where in other situations that specific accommodation perhaps isn't requested? Can you just explain a little bit? And then also perhaps if you want to add something to the effect of what Delisa mentioned, and what type of interpreter is needed for a certain situation? Is there a cultural relevance that the interpreter needs to be familiar with or be a part of? Do male and deaf people always need to have male interpreters voice for them, for example?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So I have been deaf from birth. I went to a residential school from the deaf. So really, American Sign Language is my first language, but I am most comfortable with an ASL, an American Sign Language interpreter in the workplace, even though I'm very comfortable working in English. I work in an office where they use really a lot of acronyms. And so it is more what I refer to as PSE or pigeon signed English, where it's a mixture of American Sign Language with catching the finger spelling of those English terms, understanding all of those numbers and acronyms. So that's where I stand. But in general, outside of the workplace, I might be more lax and ASL might work for me. In a medical setting where I am not so into using interpreters, I'd rather just be me and the doctor because I feel like it's such a personal matter for me. I just don't want another person in the room to know all of that information about myself and my medical information. But again, every individual is going to make a different choice there. I also love captions. So with big meetings, I would definitely ask for a CART provider as well. And it's cool because I can have that transcript. So it's like my free notes given to me that I can refer back to afterwards. And so for me, that's really great. But I do understand most employers don't want to pay for both an interpreter and a captioner. And so sometimes I do have to make a decision about which of those. But in my dream world, I really would like both, having both an interpreter and captions so that could reinforce what I'm doing and I could do a better job in my office. In terms of preferences about interpreters, I have worked with male and female interpreters of different ethnicities and really diverse interpreters. I don't have any preferences about that. For me, I just care about their skill. I care about their abilities to connect with me, to support me in my work, to know how to say the right thing at the right time. And that's what I care about. But again, different deaf people are going to have different preferences. And the majority of interpreters are female. So that is a bit of the field. I work with interpreters more, but female interpreters more, but I'm happy to work with male interpreters as well. One thing that is a little bit funny is when I make phone calls, in general, what I notice is that the other person picking up the phone will have a lot of misunderstandings and think that I'm a man if I call through a male interpreter. So if there is a professional need for it, I would prefer that they have a female voice matching me just because I am a female and there's not that misunderstanding.
Now we're running out of time soon and there are several questions in the Q&A. Someone's asking, is there a good resource, a website that you might recommend our employers go in and learn some more about accommodations, or where could they go to reach out for some of these resources? Is there a centralized website that folks could review?
I know the National Association for the Deaf has some guidance on their website in terms of job accommodations networks under the Department of Employment, the Department of Labor rather, has a variety of information as well. So the Department of Labor, Office of Disability and Employment Possibilities has their own website. That would be something you could refer to. NTID and Gallaudet also have resources as well.
Yeah, I want to go back to another question that I've seen, and it was for Pat. Some others might want to answer too, but so CART providers and captioners provide captions for webinars, but what about very private, highly classified meetings? How would a company provide access in a very confidential meeting? How can we ensure that confidentiality? that the employer can feel confident that the information is not going to leak. Anyone can answer that really, but Pat.
Sure, thank you. Every company is set up differently, but in my company, Caption First, we have an entire enhanced security program. And so some of the highlights of that, the first thing is that we always use secure email. Our entire system from the captioner's machine all the way to the delivery of the text is completely encrypted. There are passcode protections. And the latest is that over the last year since COVID, this is unbelievable, but we have hired, we now have 11 staff captioners, and we started last year with 3. And the reason for that is because I have more control. We provide all of their computers. We lock down all of the ports so no one could add anything in. There's no ability to put in a USB connection or anything. So we have complete control of those captioning computers, and therefore we're able to assure to all of the corporations and people we work for that the equipment is solid. And then in addition, we have signed documents, non-disclosure agreements for confidentiality, and all of that is in place from the very beginning all the way through the process. So that is a very big issue that a lot of corporations are asking us about, and we have definitely stepped to the plate to make sure that we've got those and other measures in hand.
Yeah, with a few minutes left, quickly, I wanted to add, as a deaf consumer, requesting captioning on the website, there are typically some options. Do you want to save this transcript afterwards, or is this a confidential meeting? And so you can turn off, not to save transcript. That's another way to ensure that the information stays secure.
Does anyone have any final comments? Because I see we have just a minute before we close, and we do have one final poll for our audience as well. Okay, with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to quickly send out our last poll because we do want to continue having the audience be engaged in this webinar, and it's really important. We want to know what you want to see moving forward in our next webinar. Do you want to learn more about compliance with deaf and hard of hearing employees, diversity and access for deaf and hard of hearing employees in the workplace, the value that deaf and hard of hearing employees bring to the workplace, or something else? So add that to the Q&A if you'd like to suggest a different topic for a future webinar other than the first 3 that are listed here. Ten seconds left. Okay. All right, ensuring effective communication, accommodation, and compliance came out with 39%. And then diversity and equity amongst the deaf and hard of hearing employees in the workplace, also 39%. Very interesting. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our 4 panelists and to our whole team for your time and what you've contributed to this important webinar for our audience. We really value your time and wisdom and leadership in this effort. We're all in this working together to strengthen communication access for everyone. So again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday afternoon and the rest of your week. Okay, bye-bye.